Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at 18th and 19th century medicine. In particular, this session is going to focus on the role of individual geniuses in this time period. Don't forget that the 18th century is the 1700s and the 19th century is the 1800s. So let's start off looking at the 18th century. Well, the key development at this time was made by Edward Jenner. He was the individual genius of this period. In particular, his work on vaccination, which he discovered, the very first one in 1798, a vaccine for smallpox, was a key development for the progress of medicine. In many ways, it was progress. For example, the vaccine replaced inoculation, which was previously used. Inoculation was where a knife might be used to make an incision on someone's arm, for example, and that then they would put a bit of a weak version of the virus into that person's body with the intention that that person would catch the illness and hopefully only get a mild form of it, survive and have learnt to fight the illness off. However, many times inoculation failed very badly because you couldn't control whether or not someone was really getting a weak dose of the illness or a strong dose of the illness. So sometimes people, after being inoculated, would die of the illness they had been given. What Edward Jenner came up with was, instead of trying to sort of get people to get a weak dose of an illness and learn to fight it off, he came up with the idea of a vaccine. And a vaccine was something that would completely prevent you from ever getting an illness in the first place. So it's not a cure, but it was something to prevent illness. He did this partly by chance when observing milkmaids milking cows who never got the illness smallpox, and he wondered why. He observed them and he realised that there was a myth that was going around, or at least a story that was going around, that milkmaids couldn't catch smallpox because they'd often catch cowpox on their hands after milking cows. And it did seem to be the case that milkmaids who'd caught cowpox never got smallpox. So he tested this theory out by vaccinating people by infecting them deliberately with cowpox. And he discovered that if he infected people with cowpox, that would prevent them from catching smallpox, which was a much worse disease. Cowpox was like a sort of chickenpox illness where you might get a rash and some spots and things like that. Smallpox would permanently scar and sometimes even kill people. Jenner's discovery was really important, and in fact, he even managed to eventually, although actually it wasn't him because he'd died by this point, but his vaccination was eventually made compulsory by the government. It was made a law in 1853, so unfortunately it was about 30 years after Jenner died. However, the fact that his discovery was made a new law proves just how important it was. However, it wasn't all progress for Jenner. There were some things that continued the same, unfortunately, and that was because mainly of opposition to Jenner. So lots of people didn't trust Jenner because he was a country doctor, people in towns had never heard of him, and also because, unfortunately, Jenner couldn't explain his idea. He came up with the idea of vaccination in 1798, way before germ theory in 1861, and he wasn't able to scientifically explain why it worked. So lots of people were really, really suspicious. Additionally, some people made mistakes when they were inoculating their patients, and that led to deaths. Vaccination itself was really safe. However, some doctors were using the same knives for inoculating patients and vaccinating patients, and that led to some people actually catching the original illness from the inoculation knife. Let me show you some examples. So we've got here, this image here is made by an anti-vaccine society, a group of doctors who previously had been making a lot of money out of inoculation and now were losing out on money from vaccination, deliberately tried to scare people off using Jenner's new idea. And we can see here, this is supposed to be Jenner in the image. He's vaccinating a patient here, infecting them with cowpox to try and prevent them from catching smallpox. And you can see in the image cows growing out of people's bodies. It's trying to suggest that his idea is dangerous and really strange and such a really weird idea. And this is all linked to the fact that he's not able to actually explain how it works. And it's sort of making fun of him as a country doctor and trying to prevent people from using this new idea, which is losing lots of the private doctors' money. Additionally, we've got this image here, which is also published around the same time, published by an anti-vaccine society as well. And this shows that people really didn't like Jenner's idea either. So, for example, we can see there's images here of lots of doctors wandering around with blood dripping off their knives, and we've got people who seem to be dead on the floor, lots of children in particular. We can see here helpless mothers with their children. And then we've got doctors on the right-hand side here with their inoculation knives. So this is clearly trying to show that inoculation doctors are doing the right thing and vaccination doctors are doing the wrong thing. It says at the bottom, vaccination against smallpox, mercenary spreaders of death. So they're almost saying they're like soldiers spreading death. Lots of people did potentially die as a result of vaccination, but as we said, it was because the same knives were being used for vaccination as were being used for inoculation. The inoculation doctors were blaming vaccination for the deaths of the people, but in reality, it was inoculation, that giving people a dose of the illness, smallpox itself, that was killing them. So lots of people didn't trust Jenner's idea. There were also other reasons for opposition, which include religious opposition. So some people opposed vaccination because they felt like giving people a vaccine to prevent them from catching an illness was taking away the hand of God in things, and that God used illness to punish people. And if you used a vaccination, then potentially maybe your child or whoever it was you were vaccinating might end up being punished in a different way by God, and that people shouldn't meddle with those sorts of things. So there are lots of factors involved here in the development of medicine. In particular, we've got obviously individual genius, which was really helping very positively at this time because Jen had come up with this brand new idea. Also, the government is helping quite positively at this time. Okay, it takes quite a long time until vaccine is made compulsory and made a law in 1853. However, eventually it does become a law. And factors perhaps which are not so helpful. So, for example, definitely technology. Unfortunately, because of a lack of technology, Jenner was unable to prove how his vaccine worked. He didn't have a good enough microscope to be able to see germs or anything like that to prove his idea. And also religion wasn't really helping as a factor at this time. It prevented people from wanting to accept the new idea and encouraged conservatism. So some progress in the 18th century, but it was very limited. So what about 19th century hospitals? Well, we're going to look at before and after Florence Nightingale, another really important individual genius. So before Florence Nightingale, it's worth saying in the early 1800s, nurses were not trained. Anyone could become a nurse. You didn't require a particular qualification. As a result of this, nursing care really varied. Some people might have done some sort of studying in the form of reading books about nursing, but many people may not. And in fact, there were many stories of nurses often being drunk on duty and things like that as well. So it was very much hit and miss whether or not you had someone with the skills you needed to help you. In certainly a really famous example of how bad the situation in hospitals was and for nursing is the Crimean War in the 1850s, 1853 to be exact. Before Florence Nightingale arrived, 16,000 out of 18,000 deaths that had happened at the hospital in Crimea that was being run by the British had actually been from infection, so from a preventable illness. And much of this was happening because of the reuse of bandages, that they weren't stocking enough of them, so they were just reusing old bandages from previous soldiers, and that was leading to infection and sort of blood illnesses. And also they weren't cleaning the place, so it smelt really badly of dried blood and sort of other various things that I'm sure you can imagine. And they weren't necessarily having enough beds for all the patients, so sometimes they were sleeping on the floor amongst other rubbish and things like that might be around, and that was leading to huge numbers of deaths from infection. After Florence Nightingale, who went out in the Crimean War in 1853, herself and 38 nurses that she funded to take over there, they went to a place called Scutari Hospital, and she proved that her ideas about nursing were correct there. That it was really important in hospitals for them to be clean. She didn't actually ever believe in germs, even after they were proved to exist in 1861. She maintained that it was, in fact, miasma that made people ill. But nevertheless, she proved that cleanliness was really essential in order to treat patients effectively in hospitals. So you can see in this image of the same hospital in Scutari, the floors were cleaned frequently. She had them scrub the walls as well with carbolic acids and such chemicals like that. She kept really close eye on what things were being used, like bandages within the hospital, and always made sure they were restocked if they were used up, so that they weren't reusing bandages. And she made sure that the bedding was cleaned and changed regularly, and that all the soldiers had beds, and it massively decreased the death rate. When she returned to Britain, she was a hero. She was known as the Lady of the Lamp, and she set up a school for nursing and published a book on nursing as well. And these things made nursing into more of a profession. It became something that you had to train to do. It wasn't just anyone doing it. And hospitals also, generally speaking, took up her advice on making sure that they had high standards of cleanliness and were very organised about making sure that they ordered in enough things to treat people. So 19th century hospitals improved considerably after Florence Nightingale. And whilst we're discussing hospitals, we must discuss surgery. So in the 19th century, there were a number of key problems with surgery. Lots of them can be spotted in this very famous image here. So we've got a patient being operated on in a table, and I think you can see from the fact that he's screaming that he's in great pain, and there are having to be people holding him down to keep him still, and that's because there were no anaesthetics, or at least no very effective anaesthetics in the early 1800s. So if a patient went to hospital, then they would face great pain whilst the operations were going on. As a result, as you can probably just spot here with this surgeon making a very quick incision and trying to, it looks like, amputate the leg of this patient off, surgeons used to compete to do operations at the fastest speeds to try and decrease the amount of pain that patient might be in, and therefore it was important that the operation was quick, and this led to many accidents. Sometimes the wrong part of the patient was amputated or treated, and sometimes the surgeons themselves, because they were cutting at great speeds, might cut their own fingers or assistants' fingers, perhaps who were holding the patient down off. There's even one rather scary story of a surgeon who cut his own testicles off because he was cutting at such great speed, and the saw went all the way down through himself as well. Other sort of dangers that we might spot in this image also include the danger of infection. Obviously there would be a large wound after this, and we can see a large number of people very close by who've come to observe the operation in the operating theatre, very much a theatre for those studying medicine, hence the name today, although today we don't have a theatre or the number of people or an audience watching in quite the same way. So people very close by might spread infection. There's no antiseptics at this time either in the early 1800s even, and therefore he could very easily catch an infection and die. And finally, we've got the problem of bleeding. You can't quite spot it yet, but obviously after this patient's leg is cut, blood is going to pour out of that patient, and lots of people died of blood loss during surgery as well. So not a brilliant time for your surgery, let's say. Towards the end of the 1900s, so from the 1950s onwards, there were some really important discoveries that were made by various individual geniuses which made surgery safer. In particular, a really important one was one to overcome the problem of pain, and that was anaesthetics. There were existing anaesthetics such as ether or ether, which was known as a laughing gas. Unfortunately, laughing gas made patients cough, so they would move during an operation, and obviously that would be quite dangerous if you moved during an operation. Also, ether was very flammable, so if it got knocked over in an operating theatre, which were often lit by gas lamps, that could cause a huge sort of flame or fire, or even an explosion if you were very unlucky. So ether not particularly effective. So Simpson was an individual genius who discovered chloroform, and chloroform was a new anaesthetic. And it was particularly effective because when it was used, it could be used to knock a patient out, so they would be completely unconscious. It was a general anaesthetic, as opposed to a local one which might just numb an area of your body. It could knock a patient out and keep them really, really still, which was fantastic because that meant you could do much deeper surgery, you could spend longer on your surgery and be much more careful about what you were doing. You could go deeper into the body rather than just doing things like amputations. You could look at internal organs. Brilliant, right? Only except there's one problem. If you had too much chloroform, then the danger might be that you would overdose on the chloroform and die. And in fact, there were stories of people going in to have a toenail removed, dying during the operation because they'd been given too much chloroform. So another individual genius comes along to make this a more usable solution to the problem of pain, and that's John Snow. And John Snow created an inhaler which people could use to more safely inhale chloroform. So rather than just tipping chloroform onto a handkerchief and hoping you didn't give the patient too much, it could be carefully measured into a jar and then inhaled. And in fact, another thing other than an individual genius was the government, which was a factor in having chloroform accepted and getting people to move away from the idea that it was a strange new thing and being very conservative about it. When Queen Victoria had her 8th child, she used chloroform inhaler, and it obviously took away the pain of her childbirth, and she raved about it, and the newspapers told everyone about it afterwards, and suddenly everyone wanted to be using chloroform. Another individual genius that came along that solved one of the problems of 19th century surgery, solved the problem, or tried to solve the problem of infection, a man called Semmelweiss. Semmelweiss came up with the idea of washing your hands to avoid infection. He worked in a maternity ward, and it was in the 1850s, so unfortunately it was before germ theory proved that germs were spreading illnesses. So Semmelweis just came up with this idea of washing your hands in carbolic acid to prevent illnesses by observation. He noticed that lots of women in a maternity hospital were dying if they were treated by doctors. About 90% of them might end up with some sort of infection or die, which is huge compared to a much smaller percentage of patients, perhaps only about 20% dying if they were treated by a midwife. And he realised that was because doctors were touching, they would often do post-mortems before treating live patients, and they were transferring an infection on their hands to the pregnant women. So he told everyone about this, and he said that they should wash their hands, but no one listened to him because he accused doctors of being murderers and therefore alienated them. And he also couldn't actually scientifically explain his idea, and therefore it wasn't accepted, very unfortunately. So he didn't have a massive impact on medicine. Another person who had perhaps more luck was Lister. Lister also tried to overcome the problem of infection with something called a carbolic acid spray. He came up with the idea partly by chance. He was wandering along and he smelt the smell of a sewer, which smelt very strongly of carbolic acid, and he realised that in sewers they were using carbolic acid to get rid of bad smells, because at this time they believed that bad smells, miasma, caused illness, and he thought perhaps the same thing could be used in an operating theatre. So he suggested that surgeons should use a carbolic acid spray and constantly spray patients and the area that was being treated during surgery. And this genuinely did work because carbolic acid spray actually also killed germs. His idea was supported by germ theory, which came out in 1861 and was proved by 1865 by Pasteur. So his idea was slightly more widely accepted and surgeons used it, although there was some opposition to it because it did cause surgeons' hands to crack and bleed, and it also cost quite a lot, so it wasn't entirely popular. The problem of bleeding, unfortunately, was one which wasn't entirely solved in the 19th century, unfortunately because they didn't have the information yet about blood groups and things like that was discovered in the 20th century, and until they had that information it wasn't possible to do blood transfusions and overcome the problem of bleeding in this way. Although they did develop further the idea of ligatures, which that Paré had come up with during the Renaissance, which was tying silk threads around veins and arteries to try and stop the bleeding. But this didn't overcome the problem of bleeding entirely. Now, our most important individual genius, probably the whole history of medicine, is Louis Pasteur. You must know about this chap. So he discovered germs in 1861 and he proved his idea and published it all in scientific journals by 1865. He helped many other individual geniuses' ideas to get accepted, like Semmelweiss and the theory about washing hands, and Jenner, whose theory about vaccination and that he couldn't explain, so people didn't want to accept it. All of these things he managed to prove why these things were the case and that people should accept them because he proved that germs existed. He did this through experiments with swan neck jars and open jars when he was employed by a beer making company, in fact, believe it or not, to work out why their beer was going sour. And he discovered that beer in swan neck jars like this would not go off over a period of time, whereas beer in jars which were open topped like this did seem to go off quite quickly. He used new technology like microscopes to look really closely at it and investigate what was going on, and he discovered it was because no bacteria or no little tiny germ-like things could get into, or microbes as they called them, no microbes seemed to be able to get into the swan neck jars, and therefore the beer inside of them didn't go off. Whereas bacteria seemed to get inside of the beer in open jars, and it seemed to be the bacteria that made the beer go bad in these. There had been theories previous to Louis Pasteur's germ theory, which had used microscopes, and they'd seen these tiny little microbes, and they believed in spontaneous generation theory. They thought that actually something was already bad, and then once it was bad, then it produced germs, and germs were a product of bad things. But it was Pasteur who realised that actually it was the germs themselves, or the microbes themselves, which he called germs, which caused illness. So a really, really significant discovery. It also enabled further progress as well as proving previous ideas, because once you could understand the cause of illness, it meant it was more likely you'd be able to cure it. So definitely one of the most important discoveries in the history of medicine. And Pasteur's discovery of germs led to further progress with another individual genius at this time. Pasteur, a Frenchman, started to compete in a bit of a race with Koch, who was a German. Now, this is an example, a really key example of government and also war, actually, promoting progress as well as individual geniuses. France and Germany at the time were involved in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1890s, and it promoted progress because both countries were trying to compete with each other in various ways to show that they were better than each other. So the governments invested in Pasteur and Koch. So the French government gave Pasteur money and the German government gave Koch money to try and make sure that their scientists could outdo each other. So we already know that Pasteur had discovered germ theory in 1861, or developed it rather, and once he'd done that, well, the Germans, they couldn't be outdone, so Koch was doing lots of research, and Koch, the German scientist, discovered that what you could do with these germs is you could stain them, so he'd got one step better. If you stained germs, like you can see in this image here, courtesy of Google Images, you could spot that there were different types of germs. All these microbes and germs weren't exactly the same. They all seemed to be different shapes and sizes, and by staining them, what Koch could do was he could discover specific germs that caused specific diseases. Pasteur then went a next step better, so that was all in 1878. He'd managed to stain germs. Well, Pasteur decided that he needed to use this idea and go one step better. So Pasteur and the French government gave him money, and he decided what he'd do is, now Koch had proved that certain germs cause certain diseases, he would discover a particular germ that caused an illness, and he'd do something to prevent that illness. So Pasteur was busy trying to work out chicken cholera, which was killing a lot of chickens in France, which sounds like it's not that important, but remember they're at war over this time period, and he's trying to make sure that the country is doing as well as it possibly can, and if chickens are dying, that means there's a lack of food and things like that, so it's very important. So Pasteur is trying to work out how to prevent an illness called chicken cholera killing all the chickens. And in fact, his discovery happens partially by chance. He goes on holiday, and his assistant and himself leave out on the side some of the chicken cholera that they've been testing on chickens. They've been trying to develop a vaccination. Of course, at this point, Jenner's the only one who's ever come up with a vaccine, and they don't know how it worked. They just know that it was something to do with, a bit like inoculation, that you could infect the animal or human with something to try and prevent the disease. So they'd been trying it out with chicken cholera, but they stopped for a while, and when they come back again, Pasteur, in fact, has had a stroke. When he comes back, he's left these chicken cholera solutions on the side for a very long time. And he decides just to carry on with his research as he had been doing before. And he infects the chickens with this chicken cholera mixture, and he expects to see them die, but actually the chickens don't die. And he thinks, oh, it must have been a bad batch. So what he does is he now tries out a fresh set of chicken cholera, and he infects the chickens with it, and the chickens still don't die. And he realises what's happened is that accidentally he's discovered how vaccines work, that you could infect an animal or a human with a dead version of an illness or a germ, and the body could learn how to fight off or figure out how to fight off this dead germ, so that if it came across the live germ, it would know how to do it, so it would prevent you ever catching the illness. So Pasteur had developed a chicken cholera vaccine, the very first vaccine, and we can see we've got an image here of Pasteur with a vaccination sort of tube, and he's looking a bit like he's slaying a dragon here. He's being shown as an angel. He's very angelic. It's trying to say that he, very much like George slaying the dragon as a saint, has done something very saintly or godly, and is saving people's lives. And in fact, this one here doesn't refer to chicken cholera, but to another vaccine which he also developed, which was for rabies, another illness that was affecting animals at the time. So he also developed a vaccine for rabies. Once he'd proved how vaccines worked, this meant that other people could also go on to develop further vaccines as well. So a really important discovery. Now Koch was really jealous of this, and the Germans didn't want to be outdone by the French and Pasteur. And Koch, in fact, said that Pasteur had stolen lots of his work on staining germs, and some of the work that he'd also done himself, he claimed, on chicken cholera and various other things. So Koch wanted to outdo him, and so he went one step further. He wanted to be the first to find a specific germ that caused a human illness, so that human vaccines could be developed. And he was successful. We can see here in this image, he's holding a microscope. It's a very similar image to this one here, actually. He's holding a microscope and he's slaying this image here on the floor, which ordinarily you would expect to be a dragon, and in fact it's tuberculosis, so it's showing a tuberculosis germ. And he's slaying it, and it's because Koch was the first to discover a human germ, and it was the germ for TB. And after this point, there's various other developments that continue as a result of their work. They go on to develop vaccines for TB and various other illnesses as well, including anthrax in sheep and various other human illnesses as well. So a really key discovery. Now, I would suggest that you potentially might want to do some further reading or watching various documentaries and things like that to find out more about these really important individuals. And I've put a few websites here. I'm not sure that the links will necessarily work direct from YouTube, but we've got this one here, which is to a BBC I Wonder, which you can see here on Pasteur. It's a really fantastic resource which gives you lots of information. It's a timeline, an interactive timeline, so you can whiz through and see lots of information, and there are little clips on him there. There's also a website that's run by the Science Museum here, which is about Ignatius Semmelweiss, and another I Wonder link here to another interactive timeline with lots of video clips about the work of Florence Nightingale as well, which gives a really interesting insight into her work. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then you can whiz through that and you can watch and listen to various clips on that as well.
This large swathe of blue, and you can see why it's called. They're both called the rose.
So good luck with your revision. Continue trying to find out lots and lots about these really important individual geniuses, and make sure you have a go at some exam questions as well. Good luck, and I hope you do fantastically this summer.